All right. So, topic today is Birur Yahadus, establishing someone's Jewish bona fides. Are they in fact Jewish? So that's one of the big questions we have today. It has a lot of aspects to it, both from a halachic aspect of Bechlal, proving someone's Jewish Bechlal, specifically for marriage, even specifically when marrying a Kohen. And then it has many aspects mitzad the reality, right? So there's whatever is going on currently in the United States, whatever the situation is here now, the situation in Russia, whatever is unique to proving Jewishness, Birur Yahadus. What? Bona fides? Yeah. So there's a number of halachic aspects, and there are a number of aspects relating to the reality, which is what's going on in the United States at the moment, what's going on in Russia at the moment, what's going on in Israel at the moment. Lately, there have been some high-profile incidents, stories of missionaries that are going under deep cover into the frum community, and clearly not enough questions were asked along the way, not necessarily. Just today, there was an article going around about a particular instance, a newer names, and how they laundered themselves through a Chabad house at some point. One of their stops along the way was at the local Chabad house. So it's more relevant than ever, hitting close to home. But it seems that what halacha actually has to say about this, what is the basic halachic approach to this question, is probably not so famous, not so well known. So on the one hand, we know generally from experience, on the one hand, it doesn't seem like any person who just shows up in shul or Beis Medrash to learn, yeshiva to learn, it doesn't seem like we immediately get on their case and start checking their records. Of course, it always depends on how realistic and honest and legitimate the guy seems. You have cases where the person just, is raising red flags. But otherwise, if it more or less sounds reasonable, right, we usually don't give them a hard time. And it's like every area in life. Someone comes and tells you that they're, so-and-so. So most of the time, people who tell you who they are usually telling the truth. Sometimes they're obviously lying, and sometimes, or occasionally, you have liars who actually are good at covering it up. Even when it comes to marriage, lav dafka, there's any consistent approach to checking who's who before a marriage. Could be some rabbanim more, some rabbanim less, some rabbanim used to not, maybe they started, but we certainly know that it's not. There's no official, consistent, systematic approach, especially here in the United States. So generally, whoever is already part of the community for a while and has, a reputation over whatever it is, 5 years, 10 years, certainly more, has a reputation as a Jew, usually they don't get investigated too much. On the other hand, we know generally in Israel, we know the Rabbanut has a reputation that comes to Russians, they give them a hard time. Trying to get them to bring documents, proofs, this, that. On the other hand, specifically with the case of the missionary recently, it seemed like the Rabbanut had not done sufficient homework. So I personally don't have any personal involvement with any case like this, and this is not the shiur of halacha l'maisa mamish, disclaimer. So in any practical case, of course, you'll just reach out to a Rav who's familiar, who's an expert on this topic. But I would like to present some of the halachic background. What is the halachic discussion that leads up to the situation we are in today? And then at the end, I want to conclude with a specific thing related to Kohanim in particular. So B'chal, when you have a question about someone, so there's a few questions. Maybe he's a mamzer, they are a mamzer, maybe they're a guy, or maybe if it's a woman, maybe specifically there's a psul for kahuna, for marrying a kohen. But they all have a lot in common halachically. Let's start with a few examples, a few makaidas from before this generation. We'll start with Shailas Atshuvas Emek She'elam. Stama, you might remember, Mordechai Doiv Twersky of Harnesteipel, was a great grandson of the Mittel Rebbe, son-in-law of the Divrei Chaim of Tzanz, wrote the Chibur L'Tara Megvois. So his shut is Emek She'elam. Passed away Tafresh Samach Gimel 1903. So in Chelek Even HaEzer Siman Tes, he addresses the following question. This is the story. They asked the name of She'ela, there was a child, and this child is kind of roaming around, kind of not anchored to a particular place and family. What's the story with him? There's one poor person. Back then, you had a whole social phenomenon of poor people, drehen sich from place to place. So there's a poor person that says that when I was passing through Hummel, they gave me this kid. That's where I picked this kid up along the way in Hummel. And they paid me. Someone said, here, take this kid and take him with you and, whatever, take care of him. Because he's a Yassim, he doesn't have parents. So that's the story the poor man says. And the poor man provided a name. He said the kid's name is this, his father's name is this. He gave a family name, Hinui Familia. And then at some point along the way, someone else took him off the poor person's hands, I guess maybe to give him a more stable upbringing. But then you have other poor people, there's a whole society of poor people, and the inner dynamics of this crowd of people. Other aniyim pass through, and they start spreading a rumor that this kid is actually a mamzer. Not really, that's the real explanation for this whole story here. Not that he's just a yassim, he's a mamzer. But it was never established in Beis or anything. And now the child grew up, and they're trying to figure out what to do. What's talk of the story here? So they actually reached out to Hummel, and so it mentions there were knigas. Knigas are the books, the rolls of the names, some kind of community document with names. So they checked, they found the kid's name there, but I don't know if it said the father's name or not. It's not clear what the record said, but all they found is the name. No one remembers the story. There's no one in Hummel that can tell you right now that they remember the incident and what happened with this kid, where he comes from. So now the question is, okay, what do we do? So this was the question here specifically about a koil. They were saying this child is a mamzer. So he begins by saying that Masheher Ma'alasai Mehabeis Shmuel Siman Beis. So Even HaEzer Siman Beis Rivia talks about this right in the beginning. So we'll start with the tour so we can understand where the Beis Shmuel is coming from. Look at the tour in Even HaEzer Siman Beis. It says, Isa Adam, Isha, Ella, Higanesloi, you should marry a woman who's a good woman, which means Shelo Yehi Bo Shum Pisol, there shouldn't be anything wrong with her lineage, with her pedigree. And as Mishpachu only rests a Shechina and Mishpachas with Yichus, and what does that mean? It doesn't mean what we call Yichus. We mean that there's no Psol. So you only want to associate with families that don't have any Psol in their background. Even then, if there's a suffix Psol that mixes into a family, you should leave the family alone, not be merachik them, because ultimately, Lasad Lava, everything will be resolved. But that's only for Yisrael. For a Kohen has to be more careful about who he's marrying if there's no Psol. The Torah goes on, and the Torah says that all lands, Stamon, B'cheskas Kashrus in Oimdus, the general Cheskas Kashrus for Jews in all lands. So if a man or a woman come to get married in any land, Ein Tzarech Livdek Achareim Klal. So they show up, you don't have to double check anything. But then the Torah goes on and says, Rashi said, however, Isha Ba Lisa Isha Tzarech Livdek Acharav Kodim Shiasiuhu. You do have to look into the man. And he says, so said the Ramah as well, Meir Halevi, I believe, one of the early Rishonim. So there's a Gemara that says, Kol HaMishpachas B'cheskas Kashrus. That seems to mean that you don't have to check B'cheskas Kashrus. So the Ramah said that Fakir means if you already have a Cheskas Kashrus, then you don't have to double check and follow up after. But if you don't have a Cheskas Kashrus to begin with, what would that be? Going she'en mishpachta yedua. Until now, we've been talking about maybe people more or less now you're not checking extra. But what if you don't know who this person's family is? Then, according to the Rameh, tzarech raya liyuchsim, and eidach wouldn't be good enough according to this. And b'chlal psulei kohol, if they want to marry Yisraelis, we don't let them until they bring a raya, because maybe they're an eved. So these are the concerns of those who are more machmer, that are more machmer. But the Torah concludes by saying, the lishna, the kolam mishpachas b'cheskas kashrus ein mashma kedvarav. The phrase of the robe b'cheskas kashrus really sounds to me that there is no other chazaka. This is the chazaka that the Torah says that without any other information is a cheskas kashrus. Goes on, he says, Rabbi Tam said that the only concept of bedika is when there's kahuna involved. And even for kahuna, the man checks out the woman, but the woman doesn't have to check out the man. Kehenis is not limited in who she can marry. But if there's no tzad kahuna, according to Rabbi Tam, then there's no concept of bedika. But the Torah goes on to say that in his opinion, he thinks that even for yuchsei kahuna, you don't need bedika. Because there's the Mishnah of Hanese Isha, Tzarech Livdek, Bedalani Maisel, the concept of looking into the mothers, 4, 8, 10, for those who remember. So Rav Yehuda Marav said that's all Rav Meir Chachamim say Chol Mishpachas B'Cheskas Kashrus. And then someone else says B'Shem Rav, unless there's an actual error, someone says that I'm telling you this person is a problem, then you have to be baidik. But stama, you don't have to be baidik. So from this comes that even for kahuna you don't have to check at all. The Torah says, however, maybe halachic is tam mishnah, so maybe halacha is like Rav Meir. That's how the Torah addresses this topic. You look in Shulchan Aruch. In Siman Beis, so in Sif Aleph, the Mechaber says, don't marry any woman who has a pisel, okay? Sif Beis, Kol HaMishpachas B'Cheskas Kashrus, Mutter Lisa Mehem L'Chatchila. That's all the Mechaber has to say on the topic of stam a person. Everyone's B'Cheskas Kashrus, so it seems like Mechaber is going with the Torah's opinion that we're very lenient, we're not throwing barriers up in people's way. Then in Siv Gimel, it says, if there's an itter, and what's an itter? That two came along and said, yeah, we're telling you there's a mamzer, a chol, someone mixed into this family, avdos, then it's a suffix. So if there's a mishpacha of kehanim, then they shouldn't marry until they check the 4 imois, which is really 8, etc. But stam isha bal linase eina tzricha livdik shlei huzru kshedes linase l'psulim. So Mechaber really seems to be going here with the Torah, very lenient. Generally, you don't have to ask too many questions. You could tell, though, there are other opinions within the Rishonim. So now we get to the Beis Shmuel that the Shoyel mentioned already today, Meksheila. If you look on the Beis Shmuel, right, so the Beis Shmuel is one of the Neis Kalim on the Even Ezer, one of the last, or maybe the last one of the Neis Kalim who made it onto the big Neis Kalim on the margins. So he writes in Sif Beis, Cheskas Kashrus, the Mechaber said the Cheskas Kashrus. So it says the Torah brought B'Shem the Rameh, that Misha Ein Mishpachta Yadu Alanu, if we don't know who it is, according to the Rameh, we don't say B'Cheskas Kashrus, because we're Chayshish, maybe he's a mamzer, which didn't actually say that in the Torah. The Beis Shmuel is actually adding that here. Chashir and Shem a mamzer. So maybe we need a raya. He says that's also the mashma from Rashi. Taisus Rosh and Aran hold that even if you don't know their family, we're not chayshish if there's a mamzer, only for kahuna you need a raya. And the Beis Shmuel Firzais, he claims is a raya from the Mechaber in Siman Gimel, that if this is not, I'm not going to get into it, but not everyone agrees with this raya, but he claims he has a raya from Siman Gimel, that according to the Mechaber agrees that if you don't know the family, you are chayshish if there's a mamzer. So, Chen yesh lahachmer, misha eni yadu alanu, yesh lachosh, Shema Mamzeru. That's the Beis Shmuel's opinion in Siman Beis. And again, he repeats it in Siman Gimel where he explains his raya. So the person asking the question said, okay, look in the Beis Shmuel, that at the very least in this situation with this kid, at the very least we should say that we don't really know who his family is. If we don't really know who his family is, so according to the Beis Shmuel, it should be Machmer, right? So that's where the Emek She'ela starts responding and going in the opposite direction. So he says, "Be'emes hachreinim kulam chalkam alav." According to the Beis Shmuel, all the hachreinim argue in the Beis Shmuel. First one is the Beis Meir. What does the Beis Meir say? So the Beis Meir is Meir Posner, passed away in the early 1800s already. So it's on Even Ezer. So the Beis Meir says, "Cheskas Kashrus." The Beis Shmuel quoted the Rameh. This is actually look in the Torah. The Torah didn't say Chashash Mamzer, it only said Chashash Evet. And maybe he holds that Mamzer is different than an Evet. Maybe Taka to be Chashash for an Evet, but to be Chashash for a Mamzer, Makinim Yisira Mamzer Mishabenehem. If there was a Mamzer, we would know about it. It's the kind of thing people make it their business to know. So maybe even the Rameh wouldn't be chayshish for the chash mamzer. So what are you talking about? Shenkin and Evid has to bring an ayah that a person with this chash Evid situation, the chash Evid, to bring an ayah that your mother's Jewish. So that's just your mother, though. The mother doesn't clarify the mother. We always know who a person's mother is. The question of the mamzer comes from the father. And Eved, you have to be mevar that your mother's Jewish. And once you mevar that, it's Eved. But even the Ramah would never say that you have to prove who your father is to prove that you're not a mamzer. He says, and this fits nicely with the Gemara in Yavamis. Now, this is a Gemara that we actually quoted once in a Shiur. We had a Shiur about someone who's born from a Jewish mother, a non-Jewish father. And one of the Gemaras says that if Yehuda told someone like that to go travel somewhere else where they don't know you, and they'll get away with it. You can get married. So Yehuda obviously had this. That's no problem with him marrying, even though in Gemara as a whole didn't dvarim shakla, but that's what Yehuda said. So Beis Meir says, how would that work if he shows up and no one knows him, and then they immediately say, no, we don't know who you are. Maybe you're a mamzer. Prove who your father is. He could prove that he's not a mamzer, but the problem of no one wanting to marry him because his father's not Jewish would immediately come back once he tells them who his father is to prove that he's not a mamzer. So obviously, the assumption is if he's going to go there, he's not going to have to prove that he's not a mamzer. He's not going to have to tell them who his father is, so they won't know his father's not Jewish, and that's how he gets his chance. That fits nicely with that. And then the Beis Meir says, so he says, as a fact, the Beis Meir says, our minhag is, we never check. Okay? He says, so that's, and he says, it's based on a Rashi, without getting into what about the other Rashi that was quoted in the Torah, but he says there's a Rashi in Yavamis that says that you have to bring a raya just because you have a bris milah, maybe you're a gavaini. So he says, so kumta is that if you have a milah, the only ichshash is whether you're a gavaini. But if we can eliminate the gavaini ichshash, seems that milah is a siman of gairus or whatever. And today we don't have gavainim, and Yishmaelim don't have priya. So it's not like Yishmaeli would be able to just pass himself off as a Jew. And we don't have avodim anymore with the bris milah. So mamela, any man who shows up with the bris, according to this, we can say there's no chash gavaini, no chash Yishmaeli, no chash eved. So we're good. Lachin lechashina, and that's why we're not chayshish, the Beis Meir says. Huh? He established by saying that we don't have to be chayshish for mamzer. There is no makkah that says to be chayshish for mamzer. The makkah of the Ramah says to be chayshish for an eved. For an eved, you have to prove from the mother, maybe. And today we don't have a chash eved b'chol. And mamzer wasn't mentioned. The Gemara doesn't mention. So that was his claim. That's why we don't care about either thing. So based on this Beis Meir, back to our situation. So even if we don't know exactly what's going on here, that alone should not be a pagam. However, later on, the Emek Shel is going to address the question. Here is not just we don't know. In this case, people were saying that there's a problem. So how are we going to deal with that? We'll get to that in a moment. But right now, it's just addressing the Beis Shmuel as a general rule. If we don't know, are we chayshish? Beis Shmuel said, yeah. Beis Meir says, no. Shar HaMalach, Atzir Razim, other Mekaynis. He says, really, there's even a Bach himself. There's different people quote different things from the Bach. But he says, there's the Bach and Yered Deya. Yered Deya, similar to Reish Samachas. Until now, we've been discussing the context of a mamzer, things like that, Hilchas Pir V'Rivya. And Yeridei Reish Samachas, the context is Hilchas Geirus. And there the question is going to be more like the question we have today, more commonly, is this person a guy or not? So if you look at the Torah in Yeridei Reish Samachas, Hilchas Geirus, it says, a Ger Shabbat, Ger comes and he says, I was in this guy or in this Beis Din, he's not Naman, either in Eretz Yisrael or in Chutz La'aretz until he brings a raya. He doesn't need full edus, just a gili milsa. Some say he needs edus gemura, but then the Torah clarifies and says that this is only if we knew he was a guy until now, and suddenly he shows up and says, "Oh, I got a gerus." But if we never knew this person b'chlal, a person just shows up out of the blue and says, "Letting you know my life story. My life story is I was a guy, and then I was this guy based in Pliny." Then is Neman. So the Bach stells it on this, addresses this. He says this is a Taisvis and the Rosh B'Shem Rabbeinu Tam, and he says it's mashma they're not machalik between Eretz Yisrael and those days when everyone had a chazak of being a yid and Zman Hazeh, where most are not yidden. It seems like according to this shita, he's always neman, even to marry him off to a Jewish woman. And then he quotes the smag. So the smag, the context in the smag is it's the mitzvah shalela harchik mitzri, malav b'kol until ad gimel, past gimel deiros. And that's where the Smag gets into the union of Geirim B'chlal. And the Smag writes that in Perek HaCholetz it says, Mishabav Amar Geirani Yochel Nekablenu Talmud Loimar V'chi Yoger Itcha Ger Itcha B'muchzik Loch. You have to bring Eidim. That's what the Gemara says. But Rabbeinu Yaakov, Rabbeinu Tam explains, that we knew already that he was a guy. But if you didn't know who he was, that he could have told you, I'm a Yid B'chlal. He would just show up and say, I'm a Yid. You would have believed him. So if he shows up and says, I was a guy and I became a Yid, we also believe him. And brings the same raya from Yevamis that Chachamim told people that were Pegumim to just go undercover. Another interesting raya that he quotes, or this quote is the famous Meis in the Gemara Pesachim. Right? We know the guy used to go and eat the Karban Pesach until his cover was blown. Kumtais that no one ever thought to ask any questions until then. Kumtais that they never, the practice, they didn't ask. So that's another raya. And then the Smag says, Maisim b'chol yoyim. Every day we see she'orchim boim ve'einonu boitkem achareihem she'simonu imohem yayin v'eichlem mishchitasam. Strangers show up. We have no idea who they are, and we never do a background check. We drink their wine. We eat their shchita. That's the Smag. So the Bach quotes this Smag here, and that's what the Bach seems to be saying. He says, the Rambam says that now you do have to bring a raya, and then you can marry. Ma'ila also b'yuchsin, and the Shulchan Aruch in this simon brings the b'shem the Rambam. But Bach says, Mihu noegem lahakel lahaminoi afla siya Yisrael. So he seems to be pushing back and saying that the practice is the ger as well. The ger just shows up, and most gerim apparently it was more of a situation. Either if you knew who the ger was, then you probably knew what the ger is. It happened in the same place, and if you didn't know him before, so you showed up and you checked, and they would marry him off. So and he says it could be that even the Rambam would be moide if stam orchim show up. The Rambam only said he disagrees with them in a time that if a person shows up and tells you, by the way, I'm a guy. By the way, I'm a ger. So even though the Chayyid is a migu to say that he's Neman, the Rambam holds. No, we don't say my loss of Yuksin. Once you say that, you have to prove. But even the Rambam would be made by stam orchim, like the Smag, that we don't check. Right? So he has to have two strikes. He has both not knowing him and that he admits he's a ger. So the Bach seems to be saying la halacha that that's what they did. So we have edus from Chazal, rayas from Chazal. We have edus from the Smag. We have edus from the Bach. So Emek Shel is quoting that, and the Shach quotes the Bach there. Just copies and pastes from the Bach. So he says, "We didn't didan. We b'chlal know that the Yid comes from. I mean, there was a Yiddish person that was taking care of him. Everything about his background is Jewish. If you just want to talk about a general question, what's this kid's background? Clearly, his background is Jewish. That's not in doubt. And he has a bris, and a bris should be a siman that he's b'chaskas Yisrael. So there should be no chash mamzeros according to these mekayres that we've just laid out. However, then we comes to the question: this is all geret if there's no error. No one actually came and said there's a problem here. But in this case, people came and said there's a problem here. So the we should be chayshish, and apparently according to Ram, you would need two edim. So you have all these zaniyim that are saying that he's a mamzer. But so this is how the Emek Shel deals with this question. He says in Ksubis we see that in the case of a koil, an eid echad is good enough against the koil. So we have an eid echad. The ani said, the poor person said that he is kosher, so it's the eid echad, the ani against the koil. However, the ani didn't actually come to Beis Din. Is this really an eid echad if he doesn't actually testify in Beis Din? So he says, so this is how he addresses this. He says, there's a shach in Yeridea that says that so even chutz lebeis din is kamei shehered bebeis din. If there's a raiv, then even if an eid echad says something outside of beis din, it counts like it is in beis din. So there's a raiv here also, a raiv children, not mamzerim. Right? Linyan mamzer have iruba, nesuas raiv bilis achar bal, arusis or a miyuta. So a question of a mamzer is like a question of shchita. Roiv children not mamzerim. So even though the Eid Echad didn't testify in Beis, then according to that shach, it's good enough. Then he goes on and makes another point that Bechlal, he says this is an Isser D'Rabbanan, so an Eid Echad should be good enough here, which is a separate discussion, is Savik Mamzer an Isser D'Rabbanan, but that's what he says, Savik Mamzer is Isser D'Rabbanan, so Eid Echad is good. And then he adds that Bechlal, when it comes to Yisur and Eid Echad Ne'em B'Yisurin, we don't talk about Pasal Eidos, right? Women are also Ne'eman Eid Echad Ne'em B'Yisurin. So we have two Eidim here, Ha'ani V'Ishtoi, the poor person and his wife can count, she's not Pasal Eidos, correct, we don't care, they can be made together. He says also there's the Ksav from Hamil that his name is in the books. His name is in the books. That indicates that he was a kosher kid. Why would they put him in the books without comment? And finally, the final question he addresses here is, there's a reisa here that the child himself doesn't know who he is. Usually when you have a question, a challenge, the person is saying, I know I'm fine, or we're not sure whether we should believe him. Because over here, he himself doesn't know. Right? In certain cases, is the case of the Gemara. The Gemara says the person has to testify. When I was a kid, they took me out of school, and they took me to the mikveh, and that's how I remember, and I know who I am. So person knows who he is. But in this case, it doesn't matter because this Eid Echad, this Ani says he's Vadei kosher. So even the Rameh who's Machmer, usually that's Tam Cheskas Mishpacha. Tam a person, the Rameh is saying you can't rely on the Cheskas Mishpacha, you have to do a beer. But Cheskas Mishpacha is nothing. What's a Cheskas Mishpacha? They've been around, we know them. Here's an Eid Echad saying, I know that he's kosher. So he says he thinks everyone would agree that there's no problem. We can marry him off. That's how the Emek Sheila concludes. It is a bit of a tough question, so you should ask other Rabbanim as well. So this was all with regards to a very specific question, specific case, which is interesting. It doesn't necessarily repeat itself so often. I don't know how often, poor people come into town with an unknown child. Of course, there are other variations of that, of children left by a doorstep or things like that. But it's not the most common situation. But even without the rest of the tshuva, the beginning of the tshuva, the Emek Sheila established that Bechlal, we don't go with the Beis Shmuel if you don't know who he is. You go with the Beis Meir and the others in the Bach who said that we don't check. The generation before him, we also find in the Shas Tshuva Sa'elef L'cha Shlema from the Goyen Reb Shlomo Kluger, very famous Chaber. We actually quoted him in the Shiur about the controversy in Yasi over the beginnings of the minig of selling the chametz all to one person who then sold it to the Rav. So Shlomo Kluger was very involved in that, as we discussed then. He passed away in Tafish Chavtes, that would be 1869, so 30 years earlier or so. So he has a tshuva in Halaf L'Chashleim Eben Ezesim and Tazvav, and he has just a very general, but doesn't seem to be in response to a question. He just makes a general statement. It says in Shulchan Aruch Eben Ezesim and Beis, Kol Mishpachas B'Cheskes Kashrus. You have the Beis Shmuel. He talks about that a little bit, and he says, B'Guf Adin Mashe Chayesh Beis Shmuel L'Chumra. He says, let me tell you the Metzias. Hine Minhagenu Be'emes Shekol Ish Ve'isha Aboyim Li'Nosei In Chaykrim V'Dershan Achamish B'Chasein Klal. Again, he's telling us in the mid-1800s in Poland, the minig is still that anyone shows up, we don't do any investigating, no beer. So Karchen, so Fishta proves that we are practicing Kasevrim the way Chashina Lachi. He says, even for a Kohen, I think we shouldn't be Machmer, because you see, we never had this minig, we're not medaktik achar shum mishpacha. Kol isha bal yinasei mechaskina noisa becheskas ksheda liyinasei l'kayin ve'matzrichim lahaviraya kein nida li ledina. So he's attesting that in his time and place, right there, he never looked into it, even for kahuna. So even though it's not as simple and straightforward as we're making it out to be, there are more svarim, more shittas, more wrinkles to the debate. But it seems that we could overall sum up and be magdir and say that until recently, till the last 100 years, it seems like there wasn't really such a concept of bir yadus. We're looking into people's Jewishness, looking into their yuchsin, etc. Stam, like that. Yeah.
Would that Beis Hill, that says that
we're getting to Beis Hill. Yeah.
he was later?
No, he's earlier, but I was going to get to him. Just someone is going to quote him in a minute. So how did we get? But aside from the Beis Hill that we're going to get to, but you see a lot of these Makayas that seem to be saying that it was not really known, not really a common thing. So the next makar is the Shalos Teshuvos Kiryas Chana Dovid. Kiryas Chana Dovid is Rabbi Dovid Hakayin Sikli, passed away in 1949. He was a Dayan and now based in Oran in Algeria. So this is his short Kiryas Chana Dovid. So it's addressed to Hassani, Chacham, Meir Tzedek in the city of Melilla. Melilla in English, Melilla is a city in North Africa that belongs to Spain. For those familiar with the geography, it's a little complicated there. So there are chunks, small parts, two cities in North Africa. We know that Spain is right across the very narrow strait over there. So Spain has a chunk of North Africa that it claims as its own. Melilla is one of those places. And the Rav there, his son-in-law, is Rav David Shleima Hakayin. Apparently his last name was Saban or something like that. And this is a question and answer from the year Tafresh Tzaddik, 1930. So we're getting even more recent. And someone showed up, Meir and said, I'm a Yid, he had a bris, and can we believe him? Can we trust him? What do we do? So the Kiryas Chana Dovid begins by quoting the Torah, Rabbi Nazar, Beis, the Rameh, etc. There's Machlekes, gets to the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch just seems to go with the Torah. It says, Elo Shreisi, the Rav Beis Shmuel. So then he quotes the Beis Shmuel. He says, B'cheinu das, Harav Beis Hill. Okay, so the Beis Hill is also on Eben Ezer, of Hill, of Tali Tzvi, lived in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, in the Lithuanian part, in the 1600s. And the Beis Hill writes, Misha ba me'eretz acheres, hein ish, hein isha, bachar, besula, almana, almana, tzarech haraya shehu Yisrael. So he does say that you have to prove that you're Jewish. V'av shemisnagim kadas Yisrael, or medabrim kol hashayim, even if they are from and they speak Yiddish, v'yodim b'chol tiv ha'yehudim, and they seem totally with the program, they know what's up. Alpha begins tzrichin raya, and he says, v'chein hi takonis medinos lita. Taka says that was the takana in the Lithuanian Commonwealth. She'en l'sadeh shum kiddushim, elam ken yesh raya, shu Yisrael, u'meyez mishpacha, etc. And he concludes, he doesn't quote it, but he still concludes, v'chein ha'reisi halacha l'mayis. I had a specific instance, v'ish v'isha shabo me'eretz Moskva. You see that even in the 1600s, the problem will always seem to come from people coming from Moskva, the Chadayma. So, Gazarti, Aleihem, Sheyifrishu Zamizeh, I said, I got to break the whole thing up. Ad Shevir Raya Shehem Yisraelim. Meaning they both batsam, there's a suffix on both of them, and yet one can't be with the other because each one, we don't know who they are. So you have this Beis Hill. So the Kiryas Chana Dovid says that fine, we have these opinions. He says, I think that even those who tackle that you don't have to check, Mistama, they also only hold that Koza Shiyadanu boy Shemisnai Kedas Moshe Yisrael B'chol Yanov Ela Shelo Yadanu Ma Tivay Me'ayin Huzeh. Even those who say that we do accept, but they have to seem like they're from, they have to fit the part. But if we don't know, or if we know that he's not misnaig, then I'll leave with the kuliya alma chashinum. Okay, so this is a big yesod the Kiryas Chana Dovid introduces here. May have been the first to say that in the situation, and as we reach the last century, this becomes a lot more common, where you have people that say they're Jewish, but lav dafka they have any connection to the Jewish community, frumkeit, etc. So the Kiryas Chana Dovid says that even those who are lenient, that shita would only be if the person's from. Then he goes on to quote the Beis Meir. I saw the Beis Meir, who disagrees with the Beis Shmuel. And after he quotes the Beis Meir again, he says, like I said before. Then he quotes the Torah Yeridea, and he gets to the Bach. And again, he concludes, so then he concludes the tshuva by saying, you're telling me, Yedidi, that you asked him, who are you? And the guy said, I was born in Eretz Yisrael in Yerushalayim, and then my parents apparently abandoned him, left him behind in Eretz Yisrael, and today they're far away, Beir, Kuba. Now, usually in Svarim from this period, Kuba means Kuba, Azerbaijan, so kind of a verf in a place. Probably hard to track down. He says, Yedidi. So let me tell you something. Zerish, this person surely grew up with other people his age, B'nai Giloi. Ask him, don't just ask him where his parents are there in Kuba. Shkoyach. Ask him, who'd you grow up with? Who are your friends? When he says who they are, write to them, but they should say that if he grew up with them as a yid. And he should also say, what family did he grow up in? What's their name? And what was the name of his rabbi who taught him? Because he didn't grow up nowhere. A person, a human being, grew up in society. You'll be able to figure it out. So you see, he's already paskening Mamaisa. First of all, the point of, with the frumkeit, it's more of a question, which he doesn't say clearly, but it seems that that's the situation here. He had a bris, but maybe not. Wasn't really observant necessarily in other details. But then he concludes and says, "Do the basic information. Who knows him? Well, what do they have to say about him?" So that's the Kiryas Chana David. The next source, already after the war, after the World War II, the Holocaust, is in Shalas Tshuvas Binyan Tzvi by Tzvi Hirsch Meisels, the Weizen Rav. We also mentioned him before. The Shiur we're talking about. It's like the introduction to the topic of Meir. So I mentioned that the Helmetzer printed a letter of the Weizen Rav, who was criticizing and attacking what Rav Telushkin wrote in Taras Mayim, where the Taras Mayim was criticizing what the Helmetzer printed from Shol Brach, B'Shem the Shinover, who said that the Rambam doesn't allow into his Heichal Amayla whoever is born from Mikveh of Natal Sovanasan Sahapachidis Rambam. So Shol Brach wrote that. Taras Mayim has criticizing it, and then the Weizen Rav took umbrage and wrote his whole response saying, how can you say that? How can you cast doubt on this edus? So the Weizen Rav, he was a Rav in Vat in Hungary. He was sent to Auschwitz in 1944. He lost his whole family there. He survived. He ended up in the Bergen-Belsen DP camp after the war. He was a Rav for the survivors. Ultimately, he reached Chicago. There are many Americans who know him from there, and he passed away in Tafshin Lamed Daled. So in Binyan Tzvi Chelik Beis, Simon Lamed Vav, Simon Lamed Zayin, there's a back and forth between Rabbi Cheskel Abramsky, who was in London then, and the Weizen Rav. So Rabbi Cheskel Abramsky is writing to him, Elo Tafshin Hey, London, to Av based in Bergen-Belsen Shlita. So the question was actually about a Jewish girl who ended up with a Muslim, and she's pregnant, and Geiros, that's the main discussion. But at the end of the Shaila, Cheskel Abramsky says, I want a copy, it says in Bar Hativ, that the Beis Hillel wrote, Mishba Me'eretz Achares, etc., Takanas Medinas Lita. So you should know this Bar Hativ, this Beis Hillel. He says, after the Holocaust, it's actually very difficult now. Kasha, ba'andra l'musya kazu, lidrish raya nachayna. On the one hand, it's hard to ask for good rayas. How can people prove anything? Who knows what documents people do or don't have? The whole world turned upside down. But maybe dafka, because of this andra musya, you probably have more questions. And makom sheish chashash, bevade ein l'sadol hem kedushin. That's what Rabbi Cheskel Abramsky wrote to the Weizen Rav. So the Weizen Rav in Simon Lamed Zayin responds mainly about, again, that Ishmaeli and the Geiros thing. And at the end he says, you copy the Bar Hativ to me. So look in Shut Emek She'ela, look like Dushas Doidis Kaini. I don't remember how they're related. I guess it came up also in the Tshuva about the Shinover. Also maybe that he's related. Maybe we said then how. The first Tshuva we quoted from the Harness Stipler. Yeah. So he says, look, Neimek She'ela, who holds that all the Achareinim disagree, and it's often a Bach, and he says you shouldn't be Machmer like the Beis Shmuel. And look at Shlema Kluger and Shud Alef L'cha Shleima, who says, Min Hagenu, that we're not Cheshesh. So Al Karachach, Bitaka hold that we're not Cheshesh. That's all quoting of Shlema Kluger. So Vim Kain, the Kol Shekain, Achar HaChurban Hazeh, Shenesu V'Amachina Meir B'Kam V'Zoyer, Nebuch, everyone just came crashing here from all the corners of the earth. How are you ever going to really figure anything out anyway? People don't have the documents, people don't have their family, people don't have their friends. It's not fair to even ask. Because the Shlomo Kluger mentioned the idea that we shouldn't be machmer, certainly not b'diavad, and to not let someone marry is like diavad. So still, on the other hand, you're also right. You shouldn't be Masad Kedushin until you figure it out. And he quotes the Krias Chana David, who says that if you see that they're not religious, then everyone agrees that you should be cheshesh. So we see how this concept is developing in the last mamash, even very recently, before the most recent era of the new problems we have now, that it seems like the poskim are leaning b'chlolos more towards the Makayos that say that we're not makbid, stam mitzad halacha. However, if there's a chashash, it's a specific concern, so then there's more of a reason to be chayish, especially if they're not religious, and things like that. So, like we said, now in the last generation or two or three, that's when the problems really start ballooning. So you have the Russians who are making aliyah to Eretz Yisrael, and of course we know that Rebbe started warning about that at a very early point, and I looked a little bit. I didn't see, it's not a raya, but I didn't see anywhere where the Rebbe Mamish gets into this discussion, the halacha behind it. But the Rebbe was speaking about the Metzias. The Metzias was, what the Rebbe was speaking was that there were major problems, major issues. You could see what the problem is. And I saw you look in Shlichas Kolchasa, for example, Rabbi Shraga, on page 153, he has a collection of just individual cases where the Rebbe wrote to people about individual people, Pliny, that look into this person, look into their family, try to figure out what you can figure out about them. So you see this in practice with the Rebbe. No, I would assume each case was unique. I don't know the stories in those cases, but 6-7 letters, but in each case there was something unique about it, as opposed to Stam bal-teshuva, or the Rebbe also created many bal-teshuva, and they all came. And I've never heard that the Rebbe said that there should be an official system for being a the Jewish.
It's not before they get married. By default, people look at stuff.
Maybe not.
Rabbinical thing.
What if two bal-teshuva marry each other, and then their child already grew up in...
Just saying, and you know.
What about the common voice?
What?
Mm-hmm.
They say something like the millions of cultures between us who said they're all different.
Okay. So we have the Russians, we have also situations today with bal-teshuva, where it's been so many generations of assimilation in the interim that, by now we're not even sure, like, is this person actually a bal-teshuva? Or they think they're Jewish, they think they're becoming a bal-teshuva, are they really? So these are newer problems that we have now. And then we have, of course, the more extreme cases where you have a missionary or some other strange. We had the criminal who went under deep cover in Lakewood until the FBI found them, and there was a big sensation, whatever it was. Let me talking about 15 years ago. Not really. I mean, there was a non-Jewish person who ended up living a film life in Lakewood because he was escaping from the authorities. Along the way, he did a certain gerus by a conservative rabbi who was personally Orthodox. It was like that kind of question. But the point being that he came from nowhere and he just showed up and joined the community. So you have these strange cases. They're not the norm, but enough of them are happening as well. One of the sources addressing today is Rav Yosef and Yabi Al-Emer, Chelik Zayin, Even Ezra Siman Aleph. So he begins by saying, I want to discuss the aliyah chadasha from Bris HaMatzot. Chasdei Hashem, they're all, they're being freed, released from behind the Iron Curtain after 70 years under the communists, and now the tens of thousands are coming to Eretz Yisrael. It's beautiful. But now we have all these shaylas about the aliyah, because there's a concern that a lot of non-Jews are taking advantage because there's, it's more kedai financially to live in Israel than to live in the former Soviet Union. So they're joining the bandwagon. They're joining the Jews going to Eretz Yisrael. So now we have to know, Pashut, they're coming to register as a Yid. Are they reliable if they don't have good documents? Or is it enough that they say they're Jewish? Or do they have to prove it? Basic question. So he gets into it from all kinds of angles. And then towards the end, Zayin Ches, he gets into these Mekayres. And he's definitely leaning towards the Matirim, which, as we've seen historically, seems to be more of the norm, to lean towards the Matirim. And then he concludes,
Is there a reason to differentiate back then, like why there was no incentive for people to say that they're Jewish?
Okay. Yeah, so we're getting to that point at some point. Yeah, so he just Rabbi Yosef concludes and says that Kiryas Chana David, by the way, he says Kiryas Chana David said that it depends if they're from or not. He says it's not mukhrach, because once a person comes from a place where everybody's not from, what he understands it is if everyone's from, and this one person's not from, that's suspicious. But if the person comes from a place where it's the norm to be not from, so they're all Tenekesh and Ishbu, so why hold it against this person? The question, I guess, is it's a chiv, maybe you can say, is it a chiv or a shlila? Do we need the frumkeit, it's like an extra point in his favor, or is being not from a point in his disfavor, and if everyone's not from anyway, then who cares? That's what Rabbi Yosef says in response to the Kiryas Chana David. And he concludes and says that any Russian who shows up and says, I'm Jewish, is Naaman. But if there's like lying Ladover, if there's reason to suspect that it's not true, so then you have to investigate. Now, I don't know what Rabbi Yosef's personal influence was on the Rabbanut's approach to how this works, because these words, Raglayim Ladover, it all depends on how you define it and how you apply it. So he's essentially saying, though, that it's Ikar Hadin, you're Naaman. If there's a reason to suspect, then you have to be chayker.
You guys married a mom?
So I don't know practically what his interactions were with this crowd of people, but this is how he phrases it, how he frames it. This idea, by the way, about frumkeit not mattering appears also in the Igros Moshe, not in the context, though, of the modern problems. In the Igros Moshe, he has a Maisa that there's a person, a woman, and apparently it sounds like almost like the person was already married to her, and there was no good raya that this woman's mother was Jewish, except for the fact that she told her daughter, you should know I'm Jewish. Which is common, typical, that people are not religious, they barely identify as Jews, and then the mother tells the child, by the way, you're Jewish. So that was the only proof. So he says, Taisus and the Rosh say that, right? The person comes and says, Yisraelani Nemon, because Reiv Haboin Lefanenu, B'Teiras Yadus Yisraelim. So he says, the Ramesh says, Any daf k'shina inum shem Teira mitzvahs. They don't have to be from. Af ala mirasim levad shu Yisrael, havu hareiv Yisrael. If the rule is Reiv, then most people who come and say, hi, by the way, I'm Jewish, the Reiv of those people are Jewish. Because Goyim lo yomru atzmum shem Yisraelim b'chol hamedinas. Which guy would stop and come along and say, I'm Jewish, right? Historically, that was a pretty good point to make. Dua, the Ruba of the Goyim, v'ulei kulam, not sure if it's Ruba or Kulam, are all saying Yisrael, u'misbaishim leim Hashem Yisrael, they'd be embarrassed to even say that, with no basis. So, kol shekain, a woman who was married to a Goy, so maybe that was the situation here, a woman married to a Goy, that if she was really not Jewish, or maybe talking about the mother who said that told the daughter that she's Jewish, she was married to a Goy. So if she was married to a guy, why would she ever say that, really, I'm Jewish? The fact that she said so means that you should believe her. So again, this is before we have specific concerns. So ultimately, it all depends on the Metzias. And at that point, in this kind of situation, in America, it still seemed reasonable to say that, a case like this, why would someone make that up? Of course, in other cases, less so. In the sources that discuss this today, I saw someone who summarizes why, with Russians, in particular with Israel, you shouldn't rely on them. It says, first of all, they don't come, 5 points. Number one, they don't come from a place where most are Jews. Mainly, you come from a Jewish community. You can say, okay, most people there are Jewish. That's not the case here. Each one lived among Goyim. Bechlal, there's a group here. We're talking about Roy, right? This idea, Roy people who say they're Jewish are Jewish. But in this group, we don't even know if Roy people who are saying they're Jewish in this group are Jewish. Number three, we know for a fact that the people here are not afraid to lie because they belong to a large group. Everyone's doing it together. We're all in it together. We're all lying. And especially with Russia, where you don't even know if they're lying because it could be they convinced themselves my Zayda was a this, was a Rav, and they don't know the halachas. So they can, legally in Russia, they were registered as Jewish. So that could also be the case. The fact that, number four, the fact that they didn't act Jewish, they'll just say, it's because in Russia we try to not appear Jewish. So they'll always have that excuse, so then you can't really ever figure anything out. And number five, the fact that you come from a place with such assimilation means that it's unlikely that there will ever be anyone who can come and say you're a liar. Usually we're hoping that ultimately if someone knows them from home, they'll come along and say, by the way, you're lying. But here, it's unlikely that could even happen.
In every fraction of the Jewish community, so everyone calls themselves the other person is right.
Mm-hmm.
Like
the opposite.
Places.
Of course, this is a big incentive for them to do so. So that's why we're Pashat the Metzias. Again, it's not so much the halacha, it's more the Metzias. The Metzias is that there's a lot of suspicious activity going on here. There's a lot of reasons to think that people have an incentive to lie, could be lying, why it would be hard to figure it out. So therefore, we have to take a more stringent approach, but not that necessarily the halacha at its basis, the way it was practiced for thousands of years, really required this without those concerns. Yeah.
You could have that concern by the American jury as well. If their grandparents conservative were reformed, they think they're Jewish.
Right.
Even if they have no intention.
Right. So that probably is something that happens with some regularity. I don't know what percentage of American Jews who say they're Jewish and think they're Jewish are that.
It happened multiple times when Microsoft was saying something Jewish go out and
right. Okay. Also thinking. Usually you have a conversation with them. A person shows up. You ask them. There's difference between having a conversation and then like forcing them to bring documents. That usually doesn't happen as much as opposed to just having an honest conversation. Most people are honest. Most people will work it out together with you. You can look it up. So that's where we're coming with. That's where we're coming from on this halacha. So yeah, this is all specifically about Russia. Like in America, as we just discussed, I think till today, you could really say not every bal-teshuva ends up being checked and investigated. It still seems to be a fair claim to make. There's no rabbanot, there's no official rabbinic body that sets policies.
Even when they get married, they're not.
I've heard of instances, people have said they've heard of instances where taka, maybe even in our community, where the rabbanim were not in the habit of checking, and then afterwards taka information came out later. But the Rav had already kashered them and laundered them into the community with marriage. Yeah. So every time you hear of a story where something like this goes wrong, you're probably much more likely to say, well, okay, we're seeing these specific problems. We have to be more careful. But it's more of a response to the Metzias. Again, it's halacha versus Metzias. It's a response to the Metzias. You keep on seeing problems, so then you act to make sure it doesn't happen again. But technically, halacha, overall, the way it's understood by most poskim seem to have been generally that without these concerns, you don't necessarily have to check. So, of course, though, in light of all these situations, you have to always check when there's any serious question. You have to check with expert rabbanim. First of all, before you go on a shlichus, taka to find out what should if someone's running a Chabad house, what should your standard be when someone shows up? And maybe that's changing once we hear the missionaries are doing it. Maybe we'll change the policies now. I don't know, but you have to find out b'chlal what's considered, what's expected before you go out and into the field, and specifically what to do in cases where you had a conversation with them and it's not all fully coming together. Especially if there's any reason to be suspicious. In conclusion, I want to bring a tshuva that touches on this general topic, but from a different angle, the question of a kohen. Can a kohen marry a bal-teshuva? Now, I don't know if I mentioned it before, but I remember reading an article once, a bunch of years ago. Some woman was just writing a monologue about her life, and she describes how she was living with a guy, blah, 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 and then she ends up by a Chabad house. She says either the name of the shliach or the name of the location, and you can figure out where the shliach is. And she writes, Lefi Tumah, the shliach said, you're Jewish, and your parents are Jewish, whatever. I have a kohen here in my Chabad house, and he's munching zich to find a Jewish person to date, so I'd like to, pair you up. That's what she's saying, the shliach said. Now, of course, she just wrote herself that she was living with a guy, and that's pi halacha, that's a no-go. So, generally, awareness about the whole topic is, of course, very important, but you have this question, b'chlal, with bal-teshuva, even if they didn't write an article telling the whole world that they lived with a guy. So I'm going to quote there's different shuvas about it in the last 20, 30 years, but I'll quote it from Rav Yashiv in Previous Shuvas of Yashiv Chelik Aleph, Simon Kuf Mem Zayin. So he has this shuva on this topic. The question was, can a kohen marry a girl about his shuva when he cannot be mevar, he can't figure out exactly what her yichus is? Although there doesn't seem to be doubt that she's from a Jewish family generally. There's a question though just about a psul. Is there a psul? We couldn't figure it out. So, should he assume that there's a problem? Should he assume that shenivala l'nachri? Is she neman to be machshir herself? So he starts off by saying, first of all, we know the machlekes b'chlal, whether you don't know the family, if they have a chesed kashrus or not. And some say, even if they have a chesed kashrus, maybe you draw the line by the kohen. That was one of the shittas we quoted. But if you look in the Achreinim, Shlomo Kluger, others, they say that it seemed like even for kehanim, they just let it slide. They weren't, at least back then, they weren't mevar. But Yashiv says it's not Kedoros Harishonim. Today we have people that are not religious, so the chash that Goyim are mixed in is way greater than it used to be. Stam in the shtetl in Poland. But if you hold of cheskas kashrus, halacha is halacha. You could still say cheskas kashrus. But so the real question here is not stam about shuva. Should we be more concerned? Should we do more extra checking just because she's about shuva? Just on that, her family aspect, but she's married kohen, according to Yashiv, seemingly not. He does not mention that. There are some who discuss this. I saw someone has a whole discussion. I wasn't going to mention it, but someone has a whole discussion about Russians. The whole Russia is one big question. So, does that mean that no Russian could ever marry a Russian bal-teshuva? All the Russian men won't be able to marry any of the Russian women because all the Russian women is shaila, all the Russian kehanim men should never be able to marry any Russian. So then he says, if we're already passing all the Russian women out psulim for kahuna, let's just pass all the Russians as kehanim. Okay, then that raises other questions because there's other dinim for which we treat them as kehanim. But just interesting to see that mahalach machshava. So the second question though, what about shema hi be'ula? So he says, if there's no reason to suspect, why would we have a discussion? Elamai, she grew up irreligiously. She was in, whatever it was, high school, college. We know generally how they behave in these contexts. So she's a Safek B'ula. So he says maybe we could involve, a gynecological exam, get a reifa to see if she's B'chal B'ula or not, because that's a concept in halacha for a shivuya. If you're not sure, so that's one way to be mevar, maybe a shvuya who is a basula, or maybe, but he seems to hold that it should work here. What if we find that she is a ba'ula, and now she comes and says, but it was to a Yehudi kosher? So Amal Mekaida said, Shmuel said that people are mevar. Why is that relevant? Neither?
No,
Neither, no. Yeah, only a guy. Whatever. I'm saying not just a yid's. That doesn't affect this question at all. She says the Shmuel says, "B'derech klal, even a woman who's mezana, she has standards. She prefers yidden over guy, but because she's a chiloinus, so there's no concept. She didn't grow up with a distinction b'chlal. A lot of people, at least, don't even have a distinction between a guy and a yid." So the dairis before the mechitza mavdelas was broken, so people, even someone who's mezana probably you could say, they were makbid, that should be with yidden. But now they don't identify as Jewish until they're neskarif. So why would they pick and choose? However, he says according to a number of achreinim, we still say in the manas of cheskes kashrus, and he gets into other questions where mother is. We can rely on her to. She has a child, and the question is, who's the father of the child? And there is a concept that she could be reliable to say who the father of the child is. So she should be reliable to say, if she can tell you certainty that it was only Yid and Nagayim, that should be enough. On the other hand, the Chayr is a Shaila of Roiv. Roiv, people out there are Goyim. But, and he also makes a point of if she has a medical exam, then that makes it worse. Because if she comes along and says, I'm Ba'ula, but it was a Yid, so she has more than a month, she told you the whole story. If the doctor did the exam, and we see that she's a Ba'ula, so then maybe she has less of Damonis now. But then he says, but it could be that doesn't really prove anything, because I heard, he says, that because women put stuff there, Lisboik, Damni Daisa, so it affects the bacillin. Anyway, that's how he approaches it in a very medicalized way. But it seems like his maskana seems to be that she would have Namanos in that case. Of course, again, in any area where there's a question, Lamaisa, ask or else.